Mom! That's the man from your old photo!
A 5-year-old pointed across a crowded restaurant and said a sentence she'd repeated 100 times before about a photograph her mother kept hidden inside a book. Nadia Diop had always answered the same way, just someone I knew a long time ago. Kim Min-jae had spent 6 years being obeyed by grown men who feared the sound of his footsteps. Neither of them expected the truth to arrive at 4'2", in light-up sneakers, holding a crayon drawing of a rabbit. It did anyway. And the man in the photograph had never once stopped looking for the woman who supposedly walked away from him, because in his memory, she was the one who left. Rain hit the windows of Auntie Sue's table in fat, unhurried drops, the kind that made the whole street outside blur into smears of red brake lights and neon. Inside, the restaurant smelled like sesame oil and broth, and the particular sweetness of plantains frying in the back. Nadia's contribution to the menu, the one dish that had made this tiny neighborhood spot famous enough that people crossed the city for it. Nadia Diop moved between tables with a stack of plates balanced along her forearm, the way she'd learned working restaurants since she was 19. Her braids were pulled back, a pencil tucked behind one ear, and she was laughing, actually laughing, head tipped back, at something old Mr. Jang had said about his mahjong game. At the corner table, Zara sat with a coloring book, her tongue between her teeth in concentration, humming a song from a cartoon that had been playing on loop in their apartment for 2 weeks straight. Neither of them noticed the black sedan pull up outside. Neither of them noticed the 2 men who got out first, scanning the street with the flat, practiced eyes of men whose entire job was noticing things before anyone else did. Nadia noticed the 3rd man. She didn't mean to. She was reaching for a water pitcher, mid-motion, mid-sentence. "Mr. Jang, if you cheat at mahjong again, I'm cutting off your kimchi jjigae." And then the door chimed, and a man in a charcoal coat stepped in out of the rain, and the pitcher slipped half an inch in her hand before she caught it. He hadn't changed the way she'd imagined he might. Older, yes, the boy's softness gone from his jaw, replaced by something carved and deliberate, but the eyes were exactly the same. She had spent 6 years telling herself she'd forgotten the exact shade of them. She hadn't. He was already being led to the private room in the back by the restaurant's owner, murmuring something about a reservation, about Director Kim, about "this way, please," and he hadn't looked at her yet, hadn't seen her. He was scanning the room the way important men scan rooms, cataloging exits without meaning to, and his gaze slid straight past the waitress by the window. Nadia set the pitcher down very carefully, because her hands had started to shake, and she did not have the luxury of shaking hands. Not with a 5-year-old 15 feet away. Business meeting, she told herself. He'll be in the back room. He'll never see her. He'll pay, he'll leave, and this will be a story I tell no one, ever, for the rest of my life. She almost believed it. Then Zara looked up from her coloring book, the way kids do, following some current adults can't feel, and her eyes tracked across the room and landed on the man in the charcoal coat being seated at the private table. Her whole face lit up. "Mom," Zara's voice carried, sweet and clear and utterly without malice, the way only a child's voice can cut through a room. "Mom, look, that's the man from your old photo." The restaurant did not go silent all at once. It went silent in a wave, table by table, the way a held breath spreads. Mr. Jang stopped mid-sentence. The owner's hand froze on the back of a chair, and Min-jae, who had not looked at the waitress by the window, who had not thought about Seoul Rain or a girl named Nadia in longer than he let himself admit. He turned it slowly, the way a man turns when he already suspects what he'll find and is trying to give himself one more second of not knowing. 6 years disappeared in the time it took him to blink. Nadia didn't move, couldn't. Every instinct she'd built over 6 years of careful, disciplined survival told her to grab Zara, say something about the kitchen, disappear through the swinging door, and not come back out until the black sedan was gone. But Zara was already climbing down from her chair, drawing forgotten, walking toward the private table with the fearless directness only small children have, and Nadia's feet were moving before her brain caught up, because whatever else was true, whatever this man had once done, she was not going to let her daughter walk alone toward a table full of men who looked like they carried guns under their jackets. "Zara." Nadia reached her daughter in 3 strides, hand landing light on her shoulder, voice pitched for calm, even though her pulse was doing something violent behind her ribs. "Sweetheart, let's let the customers eat." "But Mom, it's really him." Zara looked up, utterly unbothered by the tension crackling over her head. "The man in your book, the one you keep by the—" Zara, sharper this time, not unkind, final. The two men flanking the private table had gone rigid, hands drifting toward the inside of their jackets in the particular way of men trained to treat any unexpected variable as a threat. One of them said something low and fast in Korean. "Should we?" And Min Jae raised two fingers off the table, a small, absolute gesture, and both men stilled instantly. Then he looked at Nadia. Really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look at anything in longer than 6 years. Not at a face, not at a memory, not at the particular way someone's mouth could make him forget the entire weight of who he'd become. Nadia. Her name in his mouth sounded rusted, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time and wasn't sure it wanted to be. You're here, in Seoul. I work here." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Waitress flat, professional, a wall built out of years of practice. "Can I get you anything? Or is your table already handling that?" It was a knife of a sentence, and she meant it to be one. Min Jae flinched, actually flinched. Something none of the men around that table had ever seen him do, not once, not in 6 years of watching him negotiate with people who'd once tried to kill his father. His jaw tightened, his eyes dropped, just for a second, to Zara, to the round of her cheeks, the particular tilt of her eyebrows when she was curious about something, the exact color of her eyes, which were not Nadia's dark brown, and were not, he registered with something like vertigo, anyone else's either. They were his. Not close. Not similar. His. How old is she? It wasn't really a question. It came out of him low, almost involuntary, the way a confession does. Nadia's hand tightened on Zara's shoulder. "Zara, honey, go finish your rabbit. I'll bring you your bibimbap in a minute." "Okay." Zara, blessedly, entirely unaware of the earthquake she'd just triggered, skipped back to her table and picked up her orange crayon like nothing at all had happened. The two men flanking Min Jae exchanged a look that neither of them thought he could see. He saw it. He saw everything in that moment, with an awful, expanded clarity, the way trauma sometimes sharpens a room instead of blurring it. "Nadia," he said her name again, quieter. "Please." "How old?" "She's 5. Nadia's voice had gone flat and hard, a closed door with a deadbolt thrown. "And she's mine, not yours. You don't get to walk in here in a $5,000 coat with 2 bodyguards and ask me questions, like you have any right to answers." "I didn't know." He was on his feet now, and one of his men reached instinctively for his sleeve. "Sir, the table. People are." And Min Jae shook him off without even looking, which told Nadia, despite everything, despite 6 years of practiced numbness, that whatever else this man had become, something underneath it was still capable of forgetting itself entirely. "You didn't know," Nadia repeated, and something in her chest cracked audibly enough that she was surprised the whole restaurant didn't hear it. "That's convenient. That's so convenient, Min Jae. Because I didn't know you'd chosen your family's empire over a woman who was carrying your child either, until it was already done. Funny how much neither of us apparently knew." The words landed like a slap. Min Jae actually rocked back half a step. "I never chose anything over you." His voice had dropped, urgent now, low enough that only she could hear it over the restaurant's held breath. "You left. You went back to Senegal without a word. And I—" He stopped. Something crossed his face. Not anger. Something closer to a man realizing the floor beneath him has been rotten for years, and he's only just now heard it crack. "You think I chose the family over you?" "I know you did." Nadia's eyes were wet now, furious about it, blinking hard. "I waited 3 weeks for a phone call that never came. I went to your building, and your grandfather's assistant told me you'd made your decision, and I should go home. So I went home. Not to Senegal, home, here, to the life I built without you, raising our daughter without a single word of hatred about her father, because I decided a long time ago that bitterness wasn't a legacy I wanted to hand her. So don't you dare stand in my restaurant and act confused." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Rain kept hammering the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen a pot lid clattered. Mr. Jang, 3 tables over, had gone very still over his mahjong tiles, watching with the particular fascinated horror of a man who has just realized he is witnessing something he will tell everyone he knows for the rest of his life. My grandfather's assistant, Min Jae said slowly, like each word cost him something. Told you I'd made a decision. Yes. I never spoke to my grandfather's assistant about you, not once. I didn't even know he had one assigned to. He stopped himself. His face, Nadia realized with a distant kind of alarm, had gone the color of ash. Sir, one of the men at the table said it low, urgent, glancing at the room full of witnesses. Sir, we should. Give us the room, Min Jae said, without turning around. All of you. Now. The two bodyguards filed out into the rain without a word, the way men do when they've learned that questioning Kim Min Jae's orders has a cost neither of them wants to pay twice. The restaurant slowly, awkwardly, returned to a simulation of normal. Mr. Jang picked his tiles back up with hands that weren't quite steady. The owner ducked into the kitchen and did not come back out. And somewhere, a radio someone had forgotten to turn off kept playing a cheerful trot song into the sudden hush. Nadia didn't sit. She stood at the edge of the private room with her arms crossed, putting the width of a table between them like a fence. Say what you need to say, she said. Then go back to whatever meeting you actually came here for, and don't come back. Min Jae ran a hand down his face, and for the first time since he'd walked in, he looked less like a man who ran an empire and more like the 26-year-old she'd once fallen in love with over burnt instant coffee in a university library, arguing about whether Senegalese thibu dien or Korean jjigae had a better claim to being the world's best comfort food. I need you to tell me exactly what happened, he said quietly. Everything. From the day I supposedly chose the family. Because Nadia, I have spent 6 years believing you left me. I have a version of this story in my head that I have built my entire life around, and every word you just said doesn't fit it. Not one word. You want me to relitigate the worst 3 weeks of my life for you. Nadia's laugh had no humor in it at all, standing in my own restaurant, with my daughter 20 feet away. Yes, he said it simply, without apology, and something about the bluntness of it. The utter refusal to dress the request up as anything gentler than what it was, made her hesitate. She glanced over her shoulder. Zara was still coloring, tongue between her teeth, humming, gloriously oblivious to the fact that she had just cracked 6 years open like an egg. 5 minutes, Nadia said finally. Then you eat your dinner with your business associates like a normal customer, and you leave, and you don't come back to this restaurant again. Are we clear? Crystal, he said. And for a second, something that might once have been a smile ghosted across his mouth before disappearing entirely. Tell me about the assistant. What did she look like? Older woman, gray hair pulled back tight. Said she worked for your grandfather's household, not yours. Min Jae went very still. That's not an assistant, he said slowly. That's Mrs. Han. She's been our housekeeper since before I was born. His jaw worked. She retired 8 months ago, moved to Busan to live near her son. So a housekeeper told you I'd chosen my family over you. He said each word like he was setting down something heavy and fragile at the same time. Not an assistant, not someone whose job was communication, a woman who reported to exactly one person in that house, and it was never me. Nadia's arms, which had been crossed tight over her chest, slowly loosened. Something cold moved through her stomach. Your grandfather, she said. My grandfather, Min Jae agreed. And the word came out of him like something poisonous he'd been carrying in his mouth for years without knowing it. I need to talk to Mrs. Han. Min Jae. Nadia's voice cracked, just slightly on his name. The first time she'd said it soft since he'd walked through the door. Don't do this if you're not going to finish it. Don't open this door for me and then let it swing shut again in 6 months because your family needs you back in line. I built a life. A small one, but a real one. My daughter is happy. I will not let you walk in here and unmake that just to satisfy your own guilt, and then vanish. I'm not going to vanish. He met her eyes, and there was nothing performed in it. Nothing like the smooth, practiced sincerity of a man used to being believed because people were too afraid of him not to. This was something rawer. I don't know yet what I'm going to do about my family. I don't know what any of this means for her. His eyes flicked, helpless, toward the little girl at the corner table. But I am not walking away from finding out the truth. Not this time. Outside, the rain had not let up. Inside Auntie Sue's table, 2 people who had spent 6 years grieving each other for the wrong reasons stood 3 feet apart, close enough to touch, separated by a truth neither of them had known was a lie. Neither of them noticed Zara had stopped coloring. She was watching them both with the quiet, careful attention only children give to grown-up moments they don't fully understand but know, somehow, matter. She slid off her chair, walked to the doorway of the private room, and held up her drawing, a lopsided orange rabbit wearing what appeared to be a small crown. "Are you my mom's friend?" she asked Min-jae, entirely without guile. Min-jae crouched down slowly, the way a man crouches when he's afraid sudden movement might shatter something precious. "I used to be," he said carefully, "a long time ago." Zara considered this with the grave seriousness of a 5-year-old judge. "You look sad," she informed him. "I am," Min-jae admitted, "but I'm working on it." Neither of them yet knew how much work it would take, or that the man who had orchestrated 6 years of grief for both of them was, at that very moment, sitting in a quiet study across the city, entirely unaware that his lie was about to come undone. If this story has its hooks in you already, that ache of 6 years lost, a truth about to surface, a little girl who doesn't know she's the key to it all, stick around. It only gets heavier from here, and it earns every bit of the ending waiting on the other side. Nadia didn't sleep that night either, though her reasons had nothing to do with an old woman's guilt in a Busan apartment. She sat on the edge of Zara's bed long after her daughter had drifted off, listening to the small, even sound of her breathing, and let herself do something she hadn't allowed in years. She remembered on purpose. 6 years ago, she'd been 24, 3 months into a hospitality exchange program at a university that smelled like instant coffee and printer toner, homesick in a way she hadn't expected, not for Dakar exactly, but for the specific texture of being known. In Seoul, she was constantly, exhaustingly visible, the only black woman in most rooms she walked into, stared at on the subway, complimented on her Korean by strangers who seemed surprised she could form a sentence, asked where she was really from by people who meant well, and made her feel, every single time, like a guest in a country she was trying to build a life in. She'd met Kim Min-jae in the library on a Tuesday, both of them reaching for the same battered copy of a food service textbook neither of them technically needed. He'd let her have it, then sat down at the table across from her anyway and asked, with a bluntness that startled her into laughing, whether Senegalese food was actually as good as she clearly thought it was, because her face did something specific every time someone mentioned it. "You've been watching my face?" she'd asked. "I notice things," he'd said. "It's a professional habit." He hadn't elaborated on what profession that habit belonged to, and at 24, 3 months into a program and lonely in a way she didn't examine too closely, she hadn't pushed. He'd been gone for 4 days that month already, some errand for his grandfather he wouldn't explain, and she remembered being irrationally relieved when he came back the same person he'd left as. It became, without either of them naming it, a pattern, a week or two of ordinary closeness, then a handful of days when he traveled for reasons he never detailed, reachable only by phone, and she'd learned not to ask, the way she'd learned not to ask about a great many things in those first months. What she remembered now, sitting on the edge of Zara's bed, wasn't the grand romantic gestures, though there had been some of those, a rooftop dinner he'd clearly overpaid for, and clearly hadn't known how to arrange without help, flowers delivered to her dorm, with notes that got progressively less formal and more honest. What she remembered was smaller, the way he listened, actually listened, asked follow-up questions 3 conversations later about things she'd mentioned once in passing. The way he'd shown up outside her building during finals week with a thermos of ginger tea because she'd mentioned, weeks earlier, that her mother used to make it when she was sick, and Nadia had a cold, and he'd apparently spent an afternoon trying to source ginger root that matched the description she'd given. She remembered the night he told her the truth about his family. Not everything, not the operational details, but enough. "My family isn't in a business you'd want to bring home to your mother," he'd said, sitting on a park bench with his hands laced tight between his knees, looking more afraid than she'd ever seen him. "I'm going to inherit something I never asked for, and I don't know how to get out from under it. And I need you to know that before this goes any further, because you deserve the choice to walk away now, while it's still easy." She hadn't walked away. She remembered that clearly, the specific, deliberate choice of staying, of reaching over and taking his hand on that bench and telling him that everyone inherited something they didn't choose, and the measure of a person was what they built on top of it, not what they were handed. She remembered believing that. She remembered believing him, that underneath the empire he was born into, there was a man capable of choosing something smaller and cleaner, and she'd thought, braver. She remembered the photograph too, though she hadn't needed the memory jogged for that one. She'd looked at it more times than she could count over 6 years. A university friend had taken it on a rare sunny afternoon, the two of them laughing over coffee they'd burned trying to make in a dorm kitchenette, an in-joke neither of them had ever fully explained to the friend who snapped it. Min-jae had a copy. She'd assumed, for 6 years, that he'd kept his, that somewhere in a house she'd never see again, there was a version of her locked in a photograph, the same way she'd locked a version of him in a book on her shelf. She hadn't let herself wonder, until tonight, whether his copy had survived, or whether an old woman with gray hair and sad eyes had made sure of that too. 3 streets away, in an apartment that still smelled faintly of the takeout he hadn't finished, Min-jae was remembering the same bench, the same hand closing around his. He'd told himself for 6 years that the memory was a wound to manage, not revisit, something to be disciplined about, the way he was disciplined about everything else in a life built on control. Tonight, for the first time, he let himself actually sit inside it, instead of stepping carefully around the edges. He remembered the last real conversation they'd had, 3 days before everything fell apart, though neither of them had known it yet. Nadia had been quiet over dinner, and when he'd pushed, gently, she'd told him she thought she might be pregnant, and she was scared, and she needed him to tell her honestly whether he could actually build the life he kept promising, or whether that was a story they were both telling themselves, because the alternative was too painful to say out loud. "I can," he'd told her. "I will. Give me time to figure out how to walk away without getting either of us killed doing it, and I promise you, we'll build something they never touch." The days after that were some of the ones he'd had to travel for. A summons from his grandfather he couldn't refuse. 3 weeks he spent half present, phone in hand, waiting for a call from Nadia that his grandfather made certain never reached him, while a very different message reached her instead. Mrs. Han had gone to Nadia herself, in the lobby of the Kim building, 3 weeks after that last dinner, when Nadia, unable to bear the silence any longer, had finally come looking for him in person. Mrs. Han had carried a folded note in his handwriting, forged with a precision that spoke to how long his grandfather had been planning for exactly this contingency, and she'd read from it before pressing it into Nadia's hands, telling her he'd chosen the family, that what they'd had was a mistake born of 2 lonely people who'd confused convenience for love, that she should go home and forget him. He had never written that note. He had never known there was a call to intercept, a lobby meeting to arrange, a lie to tell. He had spent 6 years believing she'd simply stopped believing in the promise he made her, that the fear had finally outweighed whatever she'd felt for him, and that she'd taken the coward's way out rather than say it to his face. Both of them had spent 6 years grieving a version of the other that had never actually existed, a Nadia who gave up without a word, a Min-jae who chose blood money over the woman carrying his child. Both stories had been engineered, letter by letter, lie by careful lie, by a man neither of them had suspected was capable of it, precisely because they'd both trusted him in different ways, Min-jae as blood, and Nadia, distantly, as the kind old woman who brought her ginger tea of her own accord during finals week, the one household member who'd always seemed to genuinely like her. That betrayal, when it finally surfaced in full 7 days later, would hurt worse than either of them expected, not because it was cruel, though it was, but because it had worked so completely, for so long, using exactly the people they'd had no reason to doubt. Kim Min-jae did not sleep the following night either, and by morning he'd made a decision he hadn't fully examined but couldn't talk himself out of. He sat in his office on the 11th floor of a building that housed, on paper, a shipping logistics company, and in practice, the nerve center of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country, and he stared at a single photograph he'd pulled from a locked drawer he hadn't opened in years. It showed a younger version of himself, laughing, one arm slung around a woman with braids down her back, and a smile that had once made him believe, genuinely, stupidly, wonderfully believe, that a man born into blood money could still build something clean. He'd told himself for 6 years that she'd taken the original of that photo and left the copy behind on purpose, a small cruelty, a closed door. He understood now that he'd built an entire architecture of grief on top of an assumption, and the assumption was rotten at the foundation. At 6 a.m., he called his head of security. Find Han Sunoke, the housekeeper. Retired, moved to Busan. I want her address by 9. Sir, is something? 9, Min Jae said, and hung up. He spent the 3-hour train ride to Busan, doing something he rarely allowed himself. Nothing at all. No calls, no documents, no strategizing about the 11 business fronts currently mid-transition, or the 2 lieutenants he suspected of skimming. He sat with his forehead against the window and watched rice paddies blur past, and thought, with a clarity that frightened him a little, about a 5-year-old girl's eyebrows, and how exactly they matched a photograph of himself at age 6 that his own grandmother used to keep on the mantel. Mrs. Han's apartment in Busan smelled like green tea and mothballs, small and orderly, the home of a woman who had spent a lifetime keeping other people's houses immaculate and had finally been allowed one of her own. When she opened the door and saw Min Jae standing there, rain-damp despite the umbrella, something in her face collapsed before he'd said a single word. "You know why I'm here," he said. Mrs. Han did not pretend otherwise. She was 71 years old, and something about the particular exhaustion in her shoulders suggested she had been waiting for this knock for a very long time, maybe since the day she'd made it happen. "Sit down, Min Jae-ya," she said, using the childhood address without seeming to notice she'd done it. "I'll make tea, and then I'll tell you everything, because I am too old to carry it to my grave, and I have prayed every year since you were 26 that God would forgive me for what I did to you, and to that poor girl." He didn't sit. He stood by her window, watching rain streak down toward the harbor, and made himself listen. "Your grandfather came to me the week after you told him about her," Mrs. Han began, hands folded tight in her lap. He said a Kim did not marry into scandal, not a foreigner, not someone with no family standing, no matter how much you loved her. He said it would make you soft, make you a target, make the whole family a target, if her people ever found out what business Kim runs. He was afraid, Min Jae-ya, afraid of losing you to a life outside these walls, and afraid people know that a frightened man does terrible things to keep what he loves. So he lied to her. He had me intercept your calls to the house, and hers to your phone during those weeks you were away on his errands. I told her you were distant, because you were distancing yourself on purpose. I told you nothing at all, because you never knew there was anything to intercept. Then, when she came looking for you herself, in the lobby of the building, 3 weeks after your last night together, I delivered the final message in person. I told her you had made your choice. I told her not to come back. Mrs. Han's voice cracked. I watched her face when I said it. I have never forgotten her face. She did not cry in front of me. She just went very still, the way people go still when something inside them breaks quietly instead of loudly. And she thanked me, for delivering the message in person instead of by letter, because she said she'd rather hear it from someone than read it from no one. I have thought about that sentence for 6 years. Min Jae's hands had curled into fists at his sides without his noticing. And what did you tell me? That she had already gone, that she left no address, no message beyond a note your grandfather forged, saying she couldn't live in a world like ours and didn't want to raise a child inside it. Mrs. Han was crying now, openly, an old woman's tears sliding into the creases of a face that had spent 30 years schooled into pleasant blankness for the sake of a family that had never once thanked her properly. "I am so sorry. I told myself I was protecting you both from a war that would come if the truth got out. His enemies would have used her against you in a heartbeat, Min Jae-ya. You know this is true. But I know now that was his justification, not mine. I just did what I was told. For 30 years, that is all I have ever done. My own daughter stopped speaking to me for a decade over choices I made putting this family before hers, and still I did what I was told, because I did not know how to be anything but useful to the people who paid me. There's a little girl," Min Jae said finally, voice raw. 5 years old? She has my eyes." Mrs. Han pressed both hands over her mouth, and for a long moment made a sound that wasn't quite words, something closer to grief finally given permission to be loud. "A great-grandchild," she said, when she could speak again. "He has a great-grandchild he has never met, because of me." "Because of him," Min Jae corrected, quiet and hard. "You were a tool he used. That doesn't make you blameless, but it doesn't make you the architect either. I need everything you remember. Every letter. Every order. I'm going to need documentation, dates, anything you kept, because I am about to have a conversation with my grandfather that he is not going to survive walking away from unchanged, and I want no room left for him to call any part of it a misunderstanding. Mrs. Hahn rose, slowly, joints protesting, and crossed to a small lacquered box on top of her dresser. The kind of box, Min-jae realized with a jolt, that women of her generation used to keep the things too precious or too dangerous to leave lying around. Inside were photocopies, dozens of them. The forged note itself, call logs in Mrs. Hahn's careful hand, a ledger of dates noting every intercepted message and what she'd told each of them in its place. I kept copies, she said quietly. Every single time. I told myself it was in case I was ever blamed and needed proof. I only followed orders. I understand now it was something else. I think some part of me always knew this day would come, and I wanted the truth to survive even if I never had the courage to tell it myself. The Kim family estate sat behind a stone wall on the outskirts of the city, a house Min-jae had grown up in, and had never once, in 32 years, felt entirely at home inside. His grandfather, Kim Dae-sung, was in the garden when Min-jae found him, pruning bonsai with the same meticulous, patient hands that had once taught a small boy how to fold paper cranes. "You look like you haven't slept," his grandfather said without looking up. "I know what you did." Min-jae's voice came out flatter than he expected, all the fury of the last 2 days compressed into something dangerously calm. He set the lacquered box down on the garden bench between them, letters spilling slightly over the lid. "Nadia, the calls, Mrs. Hahn, all of it. I have it in writing. Halabeoji. Dates. Copies. There is no version of this conversation where you tell me it isn't true." The pruning shears stopped mid-cut. Kim Dae-sung set them down on the bench beside him with great care, as if the smallest sudden motion might shatter something in the air between them. He looked at the box for a long moment without touching it, the way a man looks at evidence of a crime he has spent years successfully not thinking about. He did not deny it. "Say it," Min-jae said. "I want to hear you say it. Not read it in copied letters. I want to hear the words come out of your mouth. I intercepted your calls to her, and hers to you." His grandfather's voice was steady, but something in it had gone thin, worn through. The voice of a man who had rehearsed this confession in his head 1,000 times, and had never expected to actually need it. "I convinced her you had chosen us. I convinced you she had chosen to leave. I did it because I watched you fall in love with that girl, and I saw, clear as anything, a future where you walked away from everything 3 generations of this family built, and I could not let that happen. Not to my father's legacy, not to yours. You had 6 years, Halabeoji." The old honorific came out of Min-jae like an accusation. 6 years to tell me the truth. 6 years where I mourned a woman who never left me, and worked myself half to death trying to be worthy of a legacy I now understand you built on a lie about my own life. 6 years, where you watched me refuse to date anyone seriously, watched me bury myself in this business you claim you were protecting, and you never once thought that maybe I was grieving something you had personally destroyed. I know. I have a daughter. Min-jae's voice broke on the word, finally, after 2 days of holding it together through sheer will. 5 years old, I missed everything. Her first steps, her first word, every birthday. You stole that. Not just from me. From her. She grew up without a father because you decided my happiness was a threat to your empire. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what you actually did, beyond the abstraction of protecting the family? For a long moment, the old man said nothing at all. He looked, suddenly, every one of his 81 years, smaller than Min-jae had ever seen him, hands trembling faintly against the bench. "I thought I was protecting our family," he said at last. So quietly Min-jae had to lean in to hear it. "But I was destroying yours." The garden was silent, except for wind moving through the bamboo along the back wall. "I never imagined," his grandfather continued, and his voice had gone rough, unfamiliar, "that it would cost you 6 years of happiness, a daughter you never knew, the chance to watch her grow. I told myself I was sacrificing one relationship to secure generations of power. I did not let myself think about what that sacrifice actually was, because if I had, I don't know that I could have gone through with it." He looked up, and there were tears standing in the old man's eyes. the first Min Jae had ever seen there in 32 years. I was wrong. I have been wrong for 6 years, and I let an old woman carry my guilt for me, because I was too proud to carry it myself. I should have been the one to stand in front of you today. Not evidence in a box that a dying woman's conscience finally forced into the open. She's not dying, Min Jae said. She's retired, and her conscience should have forced this into the open 6 years ago, and so should yours. And instead, I found out the truth because a 5-year-old pointed across a restaurant. Kim Dae-sung flinched at that, visibly, the specific detail landing harder than any of the abstractions had. "What is her name?" he asked, quiet. "Zara." Min Jae watched something move across his grandfather's face at the sound of it. Grief, maybe. Or the particular ache of realizing a stranger's name belongs, by blood, to you. Zara Diop. "She has your mother's eyes," his grandfather said. And it wasn't a question. And Min Jae realized with a jolt that the old man had somehow already known, on some level, before the confession even started, had perhaps suspected the moment word reached him that his grandson had been seen at a restaurant with a Senegalese waitress and her daughter, and had spent the intervening hours bracing for exactly this conversation. "You knew," Min Jae said slowly. "You already knew I'd find her. I have had eyes on you for 6 years, Min Jae-ya, the same as I have had eyes on everyone in this family. When you walked into that restaurant 3 nights ago, I knew within the hour." His grandfather's hands, folded now in his lap, trembled visibly. "I told myself I would wait to see what you did with the knowledge. I told myself, perhaps you would let it go, the way you let so many things go, out of discipline. I was wrong about that too. You have never let anything go in your life that mattered to you. I should have remembered that about my own grandson before I tried to bury something this large." Min Jae turned to leave. At the garden gate, his grandfather's voice reached him one more time. "What will you do now?" Min Jae didn't turn around. "Whatever it takes to earn back the time you stole. Starting today. And Halabeoji, I am not doing this quietly, out of respect for keeping the family's business private. I am going to change what this family is, from the ground up, and you do not get a vote in how I do it. You spent your vote 6 years ago." There had been a night, 8 months pregnant and working her last shift before maternity leave she couldn't afford to take, when Nadia had locked herself in the restaurant's supply closet for 4 minutes and let herself cry the way she never let herself cry in front of anyone. Not loud, not long, just enough to release the pressure before she had to go back out and refill someone's water glass with a smile. She didn't tell that story often. She hadn't told it to Min Jae yet, not in full, though she suspected someday she might, when the telling stopped feeling like handing him a weapon and started feeling like handing him the truth of who she'd had to become. She remembered the hospital room where Zara was born. No family in the country. A Nigerian nurse named Adaize, who wasn't even assigned to her, but stopped by anyway, because she'd clocked the particular loneliness of a woman giving birth with no one in the waiting room, and stayed an extra hour off shift, just so Nadia wouldn't be entirely alone holding her daughter for the first time. Adaize became the closest thing to family Nadia had in Seoul: Sunday dinners, emergency babysitting, the specific solidarity of 2 immigrant women who understood, without needing to explain it to each other, what it cost to build a life somewhere that hadn't been built with you in mind. She remembered the year Zara turned 2, when a landlord had looked at her, then at her daughter, then back at her, and found a reason the apartment wasn't available after all, that evaporated the moment a Korean coworker called about the same listing an hour later. She remembered not telling Zara that story either. Not yet. Not until she was old enough to understand it without it curdling into something that shaped how she saw herself. She remembered deciding, consciously, deliberately, on a night she could no longer pinpoint exactly, that she would never let Zara hear a bitter word about her father. Not because Nadia didn't feel the bitterness. She did, in waves, for years, but because she'd watched her own mother do the opposite once, watched an absent man's name become a household weapon, and had decided long before Zara was born that she refused to hand her daughter that particular inheritance. So instead she'd kept one photograph, hidden inside a book, and let a 5-year-old wonder, and told herself that someday, if the truth ever surfaced on its own, she would deal with it then, never imagining the truth would surface across a restaurant floor, pointed out by the very child she'd spent 5 years protecting from it. She'd built the life in pieces, a waitressing job that became, slowly, something closer to a career. The restaurant's owner trusting her enough to let her develop menu items, to train new hires, to run the floor alone on the owner's sick days. A small apartment that took 2 years of saving to furnish properly. A community. A Darze. Mr. Jang. A handful of regulars who'd watched Zara grow up tableside. A Senegalese grocer 3 subway stops away, who kept her supplied with ingredients she couldn't find anywhere else, and always threw in something extra for La Petite, the little one, refusing payment for it, no matter how many times Nadia tried. None of it had been easy. All of it had been hers, built without a single dollar or a single word of the Kim family's resources, and that fact mattered to her more than she could ever fully explain to Min Jae, that whatever they built together now, it would be built on top of a foundation she had laid entirely alone, brick by exhausting brick, and that foundation was not something she was willing to let anyone, however sorry, however sincere, rewrite or diminish. It was that foundation, more than anything else, that let her finally say yes to Saturday mornings. Not because she'd forgiven him yet, because she trusted herself enough, after 5 years of proof, to know that whatever happened next, she and Zara would be fine regardless. She wasn't opening the door because she needed him. She was opening it because Zara, increasingly, wanted to know the man in the photograph, and Nadia had decided a long time ago that her daughter's right to know her own father outweighed her own instinct to keep every door locked forever. Nadia said yes to exactly one thing. At first, Saturday mornings. Not dinners. Not weeknights when she's tired and cranky and doesn't need a stranger in the mix while I'm trying to get her fed and bathed and in bed, she told him, arms crossed, standing in the doorway of the apartment she'd never once invited him past. Saturday mornings, in public, somewhere I choose. You show up on time, you follow her lead, and if she's not ready for more than an hour, that's what you get. An hour. An hour, Min Jae agreed, and showed up the following Saturday 11 minutes early, in jeans he clearly didn't own many of, standing outside the neighborhood park like a man reporting for the most important assignment of his life. Zara did not remember him being sad the first week. She remembered, with the sharp, uncomplicated honesty of a 5-year-old, that he didn't know how to work the swing chains properly, twisted them the wrong way so she spun instead of swung, and she'd had to teach him, patiently, the correct method, and he'd listened to her with the same total focus Nadia had once watched him bring to a park bench confession about inherited empires. "You're bad at this," Zara informed him, on swing chain number 3. "I've never done it before," Min Jae admitted. "Never?" Zara looked genuinely scandalized. "Not even when you were little?" "I had a lot of lessons instead," Min Jae said, and something in how carefully he chose the words made Nadia, watching from a bench 20 feet away with a coffee going cold in her hands, ache in a way she hadn't expected to. By the 3rd Saturday, an hour had stretched, unofficially, into 2. By the 6th, Nadia had started bringing a book instead of just watching, because watching had become almost unbearably tender. Min Jae learning, week by week, the specific choreography of being someone's father from absolute zero, asking Nadia quiet questions when Zara was out of earshot. Is it normal that she won't eat anything green? Should I be worried she still can't tie her shoes? What do I do when she cries and I don't know why? Do I try to fix it or just sit with her? "You just sit with her," Nadia told him, the 6th Saturday, not looking up from her book, because looking at his face when she answered these questions had started to do something dangerous to her resolve. Most of parenting is just sitting with someone while they feel something, and not trying to make it faster than it needs to be. "Is that what you did?" Min Jae asked. "Alone, for 5 years. "That's what I did," Nadia said. 9 months of that was just me and a belly and no idea what I was doing. The 5 years since then were her." He didn't apologize again. He'd said it enough times already, and she'd told him, gently but firmly, that the apologies had started to feel like something he needed, more than something she needed to hear. What she needed, she'd told him, was consistency, proof, week over week, that this wasn't a guilt spiral he'd eventually run out of steam on. He gave her that instead. Every Saturday, on time, following Zara's lead, asking better questions each week instead of the same ones. The kindergarten performance happened on a Tuesday in April, a shuffling, off-key production about friendship and a tiger who learns to share, and Min Jae sat in a plastic chair sized for someone roughly 2 feet shorter than him, in a suit too formal for a room full of finger-painted banners, and filmed all 4 minutes of his daughter's stage time on his phone, with the intensity he'd once reserved for reviewing shipping manifests. He was not, technically, supposed to be there. Nadia had mentioned the performance almost as an aside, not quite an invitation. Testing. He understood later, whether he'd show up to something small and unglamorous, with no cameras and no stakes beyond a room full of parents and one very nervous tiger costume. He showed up an hour early, because he didn't know where the parking was and didn't want to risk being late for something that mattered this much, and ended up helping the kindergarten teacher move folding chairs into rows, a director of a criminal empire's dissolution, arranging plastic seating between a stack of construction paper trees. Zara spotted him from backstage, a gap in the curtain, a flash of her face, delighted and disbelieving, and forgot 2 of her lines because she was too busy waving at him, and afterward told everyone within earshot, teacher included, that her appa had come to see her be a tiger, the Korean word for father slipping out of her with an ease that suggested she'd been practicing it privately, testing how it felt in her mouth before she used it in front of anyone. Min Jae heard it. Nadia, 3 seats away, watched his face when he heard it, and had to look away herself, because whatever composure this man had built running an empire for a decade had cracked entirely, silently. Tears he made no attempt to hide running down a face that 4 months ago had terrified half the underworld of Seoul. She's never called anyone that, Nadia said quietly, after, in the parking lot, Zara already asleep in her booster seat from the sheer exhaustion of stage fright and tiger choreography. Not once. Not her uncle. Not my friend Aminata's husband. Nobody. I heard her, Min Jae said, voice still rough. I'm telling you, because I want you to understand what it means if this doesn't stick. Nadia's voice was gentle, but absolutely unflinching. If you disappear back into whatever this business demands of you in 6 months, if this becomes too hard, and you decide the empire is easier to manage than a 5-year-old's heart, that word, tonight, is the thing she'll remember losing. Not you. That word. It's not going to happen, Min Jae said. You don't get to promise that, Nadia said. Not yet. You get to prove it. There's a difference, and I need you to understand it, because I have watched a lot of men in my life promise things they meant completely in the moment and still failed to deliver. Min Jae was quiet for a long moment, watching his daughter sleep in the rear-view reflection of Nadia's old sedan. Then I'll prove it, he said, for as long as it takes. He learned Korean handwriting homework the way he'd once learned negotiation tactics, methodically, thoroughly, 3 evenings a week at Nadia's kitchen table, sleeves rolled up, a 5-year-old's workbook spread between them. He was, it turned out, a genuinely terrible teacher at first, correcting Zara's stroke order with the same clipped precision he used on underperforming lieutenants, until Nadia, arms crossed in the kitchen doorway, trying not to laugh, informed him that a 5-year-old was not, in fact, a business associate who had missed a quarterly target. She's trying her best, Nadia said. That's the whole job right now. Noticing that she's trying, Min Jae adjusted, slowly, imperfectly, the way he seemed to do everything in this new, unfamiliar territory of ordinary fatherhood. But he adjusted, and by the 8th week he'd learned to sit back and let Zara struggle through a stroke without immediately correcting it. Learned to say you're getting closer instead of that's wrong. Learned that the object of the exercise wasn't a perfectly formed character, but a 5-year-old who wanted, more than anything, an adult in the room paying attention to her. He learned Senegalese food from Nadia, the same deliberate way, standing in her small kitchen on Sunday afternoons, taking notes on his phone like a man cramming for an exam that actually mattered. The precise ratio of tomato paste to fish stock in Thi Bu Dien. The particular reverence with which Nadia handled the recipe her own mother had taught her over a crackling international phone line during her first homesick year in Seoul, the difference between Yasa's tang and Mafia's richness, and why Zara insisted, with absolute 5-year-old conviction, that her mother's version of both was objectively the best in the world. Better than any restaurant, better than anything. Tell me about your mother, Min Jae said, once, chopping onions badly under Nadia's patient correction. You never talk about Dakar. Not really. Nadia was quiet for a moment, knife moving in a steady, practiced rhythm beside his clumsy one. My mother sells fabric in Sandaga Market, she said finally, Has for 30 years. She wanted me to come home when I got pregnant. Told me Seoul owed me nothing, and Dakar was where family took care of family. And she wasn't wrong. Not exactly. She scraped her onions into the pot. Precise, unhurried. But I stayed because I wanted Zara to know both halves of where she comes from, not just the half that was easier to access. I wanted her to grow up bilingual, bicultural, comfortable in both worlds instead of feeling like a visitor in either one. That was harder to do from Dakar. So I stayed, and I built something small here instead, and I called my mother every Sunday and let her scold me for it anyway. Because that's love too, in its own stubborn way. Does she know? About Zara's father? She knows there was someone. Nadia's jaw tightened slightly. She doesn't know who, or what he does for a living. And I need you to understand that if that conversation happens, it happens on my terms, not yours, and not your family's convenience. Understood, Minjai said, and meant it, and didn't push, and Nadia noted, quietly, privately, that the absence of pushing was itself a kind of proof she hadn't realized she'd been testing for. Weekends, when the weather held, meant the park by the river, Zara narrating elaborate stories about the ducks that lived there while Min-jae listened with the same total, disciplined attention he'd once given to men plotting against his family, and it occurred to Nadia, watching from a bench with her feet tucked under her, that the very qualities that had made him formidable in his old life, the attentiveness, the patience, the refusal to let anything slide unexamined, were the same qualities making him, slowly, undeniably, a good father. He never asked for anything back. He quietly wired a small, steady deposit into an account Nadia didn't know existed until she found the paperwork for a cafe lease sitting, unsigned, on her kitchen table one evening, his handwriting on a sticky note, "Whenever you're ready. No strings. It's your dream, not mine to control." She'd cried over that note for 20 minutes and told no one, not even him. It was working. That was the terrifying part. It was actually working, brick by brick, week over week. And Nadia had just begun to let herself imagine a version of the future that didn't end in heartbreak, when Baek Young-ho decided he'd waited long enough. Word travels fast inside an organization built on watching for weakness. Within a week of Min-jae quietly informing his lieutenants that he intended to begin transferring operations toward the family's legitimate businesses, the shipping company, the hotel chain, the construction firm that had, until now, mostly existed as a laundering front, a ripple moved through Seoul's underworld that Min-jae felt before he understood. It arrived as a name, Baek. The Baek line had spent 15 years circling Kim territory, testing edges, always pulling back the moment Kim Dae-sung's reputation made the cost too high. A Kim family in transition, soft, distracted, its heir suddenly more interested in a waitress and her daughter than in defending its borders, was, to men like Baek Young-ho, not weakness to be pitied. It was opportunity. Min-jae didn't learn this from a briefing. He learned it on a Tuesday afternoon, walking Zara home from her afternoon program with a bag of her favorite fish-shaped bread in one hand, when a car slowed alongside them on a quiet residential street, and a window rolled halfway down. He recognized the man in the passenger seat immediately, one of Baek's mid-level enforcers, a scarred jaw, eyes that catalogued Zara's small hand in Min-jae's, the way a man catalogues leverage. "Director Kim," the man said pleasantly. "Cute kid." Min-jae did not slow his pace, did not so much as glance at the car, but every muscle in his body had gone taut and cold, and his grip on Zara's hand tightened just enough that she looked up at him, puzzled. "Uncle Min, you're squeezing," she said. "Sorry, sweetheart." He forced his hand to loosen, forced his voice into something light. "Almost home." The car didn't follow. It didn't need to. The message had already landed, precise as a blade. "We know where she goes to school. We know her name. We know you'll do anything to keep her safe, including step back from the border war you're about to walk away from." That night, after Zara was asleep and Nadia had gone quiet with fury and fear in equal measure over what he'd told her, Min-jae sat at her kitchen table with his head in his hands. "You knew this was a possibility," Nadia said. It wasn't an accusation exactly. It was worse, the flat, exhausted voice of a woman recalculating every risk she'd let herself take in the last 2 months. "You knew stepping back could paint a target on us." "I didn't think they'd move this fast." "That's not an answer, Min-jae." No, he admitted. It's not. Nadia pressed both hands flat against the table, steadying herself. I raised her alone for 5 years, specifically so she would never have to grow up afraid of a car slowing down on her street. And in 2 months of you being back in her life, that's exactly what's happened. Every word landed exactly where she meant it to. Min-jae absorbed it without flinching, because he'd earned every ounce of it and he knew it. I have 2 choices, he said quietly. I can walk away from you both right now, disappear, cut contact, let Beck see there's nothing left to threaten, and Zara grows up safe but without a father again. Or I finish what I started. I dismantle my own leverage before Becca can use it against us. I put security around both of you that nobody sees coming, and I finish the transition faster than anyone thought possible, so there's no war left to fight over. His jaw tightened. Both of those choices cost something. I need you to tell me which cost you're willing to pay, because it's not just mine to decide anymore. Nadia looked at him for a long moment, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself since the rainy night at the restaurant, and something in her chest, some last locked door, cracked open half an inch. You're asking me, she said slowly, instead of deciding for both of us. I learned my lesson about deciding things for you, Min-jae said. The hard way, 6 years of it. Nadia closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was something new in her voice. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it, tentative as a first step onto ice. Finish it, she said, fast, and you tell me everything, every risk, every move, from here on. No more protecting me by keeping me in the dark. That's how we got here in the first place. Everything, Min-jae agreed. I promise. The betrayal, when it came from a direction Min-jae hadn't guarded closely enough. Choi Byung-hoon had been with the Kim organization for 11 years, one of the lieutenants Min-jae trusted enough to brief in detail about the timeline of the transition, the security arrangements around Nadia and Zara, the exact schedule of which weeks the family's remaining criminal assets would be dissolved. He was also, Min-jae learned 3 weeks after the car incident, a man drowning in gambling debt to a casino operation that Bak Jung-ho quietly controlled through 3 shell companies. A vulnerability Bak had found and exploited with the patient. Surgical precision of a man who'd spent 15 years learning exactly how to wait. Min-jae found out from his head of security, who found out from a bank transfer that didn't match any authorized payroll, a sum too specific, too oddly timed, routed through an account with just enough obfuscation to suggest someone competent had set it up, and just enough sloppiness to suggest that same someone was desperate. He confronted Choi in the same 11th floor office where 6 weeks earlier he'd stared at an old photograph until dawn. How much do you owe him? Min-jae said. Not a question. A number he already half knew, laid on the desk between them like a blade. Choi didn't bother denying it. 11 years bought him at least that much dignity. Enough that they were going to take my daughter's college fund next, he said, voice hollow. Enough that I told myself giving Beck a schedule wasn't the same as giving him a target. I told myself I was just confirming timing. Nothing about the girl. Nothing about where she lives. You told him when I'd be thin on security, Min-jae said. That's not confirming timing. That's drawing a map. The room was silent. Outside, 11 floors down, Seoul moved on the way cities do, indifferent to the particular reckoning happening above it. This was the choice Min-jae hadn't expected to face. Not Baek's violence, which he'd anticipated and prepared for, but this, a man he'd trusted for over a decade, undone by desperation, dangling not from cruelty, but from an ordinary human weakness that Baek had turned into a weapon. He could destroy Choi the way the old rules demanded, publicly, permanently, a message to anyone else considering the same math. Or he could do something that belonged to the man he was trying to become, instead of the one he'd inherited. You're going to tell me everything you gave him, Min-jae said finally. Every detail, every date, every conversation, and then you're going to disappear from this organization entirely. No severance, no reference, nothing. But I'm going to pay off the debt myself, directly. So Bakhas has no more leverage on you to extract. And your daughter keeps her college fund. You will never work in this world again. You will also never be hunted for this. That's the only mercy I have left to give. And you should understand it's more than you gave me. Choi stared at him, stunned, some old fear visibly warring with disbelief. Why? He managed. Because 6 weeks ago, I learned what it costs when powerful men decide. Fear justifies destroying someone quietly, instead of dealing with them honestly, Min Jae said. I'm done being that kind of powerful. But that doesn't mean I trust you near my family again, not for the rest of your life. It cost him something to choose mercy over the old certainty of violence. A private, aching uncertainty about whether he'd just made himself softer, more exploitable, in front of a room that would hear about this decision within the hour and draw its own conclusions. He made it anyway, because the alternative, becoming, in this one moment, exactly the kind of man his grandfather had been, felt like a worse cost than any reputational one. But the map was already in Beck's hands, and Beck, Min Jae understood with a cold, sinking certainty, would not wait much longer to use it. It happened on a Saturday. Min Jae had taken Zara to the park near Nadia's apartment, while Nadia caught up on inventory for the cafe space she'd finally signed the lease on 3 weeks before. He was pushing Zara on a swing, laughing at something she'd said about a butterfly, phone in his back pocket, security detail thinned down because the bake situation had gone quiet for 11 days, because the transition of assets was 90% complete, because he had let himself believe, for one single Saturday afternoon, that Choi's map might already be stale, that danger, once seen clearly, could be outrun instead of simply waited out. The van came from the access road behind the playground. No warning. No window rolled down this time. 3 men out before Min Jae had fully registered the sound of tires on gravel. He did the only thing his entire body knew how to do in that half-second. He grabbed Zara off the swing mid-arc and turned his back to the men, curling his whole frame around her small one, absorbing the first shove of a body slamming into him without a sound of protest. "Uncle Min," Zara's voice, muffled against his chest, more confused than afraid, not yet understanding what was happening. "Eyes closed, sweetheart. Eyes closed, and don't let go of my jacket, okay? No matter what." He felt her small fists close around the fabric of his coat, and something in him went colder and clearer than it had in 6 years of running an empire built on exactly this kind of violence. He had negotiated with killers. He had walked into rooms where every man present wanted him dead, and walked back out, unscathed, through sheer, disciplined nerve. None of it, not 1 second of it, had prepared him for the particular helplessness of holding a child against his chest while 3 armed men closed in, knowing that for the first time in his life, if this went wrong, it would not just be his life on the line. He had no weapon. He'd stopped carrying one months ago, a small, symbolic act of the life he was trying to build. He had nothing but his body and his voice, and in that moment, with Zara's heartbeat hammering against his ribs, Kim Min Jae, feared boss, disciplined leader, a man who had never once in 6 years felt fear he couldn't master, understood with total clarity that he was, for the first time, completely and utterly helpless. "Take me," he said, voice low and steady, hands raised slightly, angling his body so Zara stayed shielded behind him. "Whatever Bake wants, it's me. Let the child go. She has nothing to do with this." The lead man, the scarred jaw enforcer from the car weeks before, smiled, slow and unhurried. "Mr. Beck doesn't want you dead, Director Kim. Dead men don't feel anything. He wants you to understand exactly what it costs to walk away from a war you started, just because you fell for a waitress." He took a step closer. Zara whimpered, small and muffled, and Min Jae felt something in his chest tear clean in half. And then, from the direction of the playground gate, a voice cut through the afternoon, not loud, not panicked, but carrying with a strange, absolute authority that stopped every man in the clearing mid-motion. "Get away from my daughter." Nadia stood at the playground gate, chest heaving from a full sprint across 2 blocks. She'd forgotten her phone charging cable, come back for it, glanced out the window out of habit the way she'd taught herself to do for 5 years of solo parenting, and seen a van that didn't belong parked where no van should be. She had no weapon either. What she had was a heavy iron gate key still clenched in her fist from locking up the cafe space, and 6 years of a very specific, very focused kind of rage that she had never once let herself use, because she had never had anything to protect that mattered more than her own safety until the day Zara was born. "I said get away from her!" Nadia's voice didn't shake. She walked forward, not away, straight toward 3 armed men, and later she would not entirely be able to explain where the courage came from, except to say that fear for herself and fear for Zara were, it turned out, two entirely different animals, and only one of them could freeze her in place. You want to hurt someone to send a message? Fine, send it to me. I'm the one who's been standing here alone for 6 years. Go ahead. The scarred jaw man's smile faltered, just slightly, thrown by a variable he hadn't planned for. A woman walking toward armed men without hesitation, voice flat with a conviction that made him briefly, involuntarily reconsider whether this job was worth whatever Beck was paying. It was enough of a hesitation. Sirens, real ones, distant but closing, cut through the afternoon. One of Min Jae's security detail, thinned but not absent, had clocked the van the moment it turned off the main road and made a call 3 minutes earlier that Min Jae hadn't had time to register. The men scattered before the first patrol car cleared the corner, back into the van and gone, tires screaming against gravel, leaving behind nothing but a shaken playground, a sobbing 5-year-old, and 2 adults on their knees in the sand, arms wrapped around their daughter and, without either of them quite deciding to, around each other. "I'm here," Nadia kept saying, into Zara's hair, into the space between all 3 of them. "I'm here, baby. I'm here. You're okay." Min Jae didn't say anything at all for a long moment. He was shaking, not from fear anymore, but from the aftershock of it, the particular tremor that comes when a body realizes danger has passed and finally allows itself to feel what it couldn't afford to feel a minute before. "That's it," he said finally, hoarse. "I'm done. Today. I don't care what it costs. Beck can have whatever territory he wants. I'm not risking either of you for one more day of an empire I never wanted in the first place." Nadia looked up at him over their daughter's head, tear tracks cutting through the dust on her face, and for the first time since the rainy night at the restaurant, she reached out and laced her fingers through his. "Then finish it," she said, properly, not out of fear, out of choice. "Because I need to know the man raising my daughter made this decision for the right reason, not just because he got scared today." "Both," Min Jae admitted. "It's both. But you're right that the fear isn't why I'm staying. I'm staying because for 6 years I built an empire to fill the space where you used to be, and it never once worked. This," his hand tightened around hers, his other arm still wrapped tight around Zara. "This is the only thing that's ever actually filled it. Everything Min Jae has built toward, walking away from the empire, earning back 6 stolen years, protecting the family he never knew he had, comes down to what happens next. One confrontation left, one apology that can't undo the damage. Only own it. Stay with it. The ending is worth every page that got you here." Min Jae called an assembly of every senior lieutenant in the organization for the following morning, a thing that had not happened in 3 years, and that sent a current of nervous speculation through every branch of the family's operations before he'd said a single word. He stood at the head of a long table in a room that had watched 3 generations of Kim men make decisions that shaped the underworld of an entire city, and he did not sit down. "As of today," he said, "I am formally transferring all criminal operations of this organization into dissolution or divestment. Anyone who wishes to continue in that line of work is free to go. I won't stop you, and I won't punish you for leaving. But you leave the Kim name behind when you do, because the Kim name, from this day forward, belongs to shipping, construction, and hospitality. Nothing else." The silence in the room was total. "Baek Myung-ho put a hand on a 5-year-old child yesterday to send me a message," Min Jae continued, voice hard as iron now. "I want every person in this room to understand something clearly. I am not stepping back because I'm weak. I am stepping back because I have finally found something worth being strong for, instead of something to be feared because of. Anyone who mistakes that for weakness is welcome to test it. I'd advise against it." He looked around the table, meeting the eyes of men who had followed his family for decades. "Beck will hear, within the hour, that Kim territory is no longer worth fighting for, because there's no criminal territory left to fight over. That makes his aggression yesterday not a strategic strike. It's just a man who attacked a child for nothing. I intend to make sure every ally he has left in this city knows exactly what kind of man that makes him. Alone, that isolation will do more damage to Beck than any war I could start. I don't need to fight him. I just need to make sure everyone sees him clearly." It worked exactly as he predicted, not through violence, but through the much older, much colder currency the underworld actually ran on: reputation. Within days, two of Beck's own allies quietly withdrew their support, unwilling to be associated with a man who'd ordered an attack on a child in broad daylight. A third, a shipping contact Beck had relied on for a decade, cut ties entirely after Min Jae made a single, quiet phone call laying out exactly what had happened at that playground, without a single threat attached to the telling. The facts alone did the work. Baek Jung-ho requested a meeting 11 days later, not out of aggression this time, but out of the particular desperation of a man watching his own foundation crumble faster than he could shore it up. Min Jae agreed to see him, alone, in a neutral restaurant with no weapons on either side, a condition Baek's own dwindling reputation left him no room to refuse. "You could have destroyed me the old way," Baek said, when they were finally face to face, something almost like respect warring with resentment in his voice. "Gone to war. Ended this in blood, the way your grandfather would have. Instead, you let the whole city watch me hollow out from the inside for going after a child. That's crueler than a bullet, Kim Min Jae." "It's also permanent," Min Jae said. "A bullet just makes a martyr. This makes sure nobody in this city ever trusts you with anything again, for the rest of your life, without me lifting a hand against you a second time. Consider it a lesson in the kind of power that actually lasts." He stood to leave. "Stay away from my family. That's the only term I'm offering, and it's not negotiable." Baek didn't argue. He didn't have the ground left to stand on. Min Jae never lifted a hand against him. He didn't need to. He'd learned, finally, that the strongest move a powerful man could make wasn't always the loudest one, and that the empire his grandfather had spent decades building on fear had never once needed to be fear-based at all. It had simply been easier that way, for men unwilling to do the harder, slower work of building something on anything else. Kim Dae-sung requested the meeting himself, 3 weeks later, through a message so uncharacteristically humble: "If she is willing, I would like the chance to apologize in person, and I will understand completely if she is not." That Min Jae almost didn't recognize his grandfather's handwriting. Nadia thought about it for 2 days before she said yes. Not for herself, she told Min Jae. For Zara. Because whatever this old man had done, he was still the only living great-grandparent her daughter had, and Nadia had decided a long time ago that she would not let bitterness write the story of who Zara was allowed to know. "You don't owe him this," Min Jae told her the morning of, watching her get Zara dressed with more care than usual, as if the occasion demanded it. "Whatever he says, whatever he offers, you don't owe him forgiveness just because he's asking." "I know," Nadia said. "I'm not doing it for him." She smoothed Zara's collar, met her own reflection in the hallway mirror for a moment before turning around. "I'm doing it because I decided a long time ago what kind of mother I want to be. And that mother doesn't slam doors that a 5-year-old might one day want walked through herself, when she's old enough to decide that for herself instead of me deciding it for her." They met in the same garden where Min Jae had confronted him weeks before, the bonsai trimmed now into careful, deliberate shapes. Kim Dae-sung stood when they arrived, and Nadia watched a man who had once terrified half the city grip the back of a garden chair to steady visibly shaking hands. "Ms. Diop," he bowed, low and formal, the kind of bow reserved for people owed a debt that could never fully be repaid. "Thank you for coming. I did not expect it, and I would not have blamed you for refusing." "I almost did," Nadia said honestly. "You should have." He straightened, and his eyes were wet, unguarded in a way Min Jae had genuinely never witnessed in 32 years of knowing this man. "I stole years from you that you can never get back. I robbed my own great-granddaughter of a father's love for the first 5 years of her life, out of fear and pride that I dressed up as protecting this family. There is no version of an apology that undoes that. I am not asking you to forgive me. I have no right to ask that of you. I only wanted the chance, before I am too old to say it properly, to tell you that I was wrong, and that you did nothing, to deserve what I did to you both." Nadia was quiet for a long moment. Zara, holding tight to her mother's hand, looked between the adults with the same grave attentiveness she'd shown Min Jae the night they met. "I'm not going to pretend it doesn't still hurt," Nadia said finally. "It does. I lost 6 years I can't get back either. And there were nights I raised my daughter alone that I don't think you've ever had to imagine, Halabe Oji." The honorific came out of her carefully, deliberately, an offering, not an obligation. "There were nights I stood over her crib, doing the math on daycare I couldn't quite afford, wondering if I'd made the right choice, staying in a country that still, some days, looks at me like I don't belong here. You don't get to know about those nights. But I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to let what you did shape who Zara becomes. Hatred isn't a legacy I want to hand her, so I forgive you. Not because it was right, what you did, it wasn't, and I need you to understand I'm not saying it was, but because holding on to it costs more than it's worth, and I have better things to build with the years I have left. Kim Dae-sung's composure broke entirely then, an old man weeping openly in his own garden, and Zara, with the fearless, uncomplicated grace only a child could manage, let go of her mother's hand, walked over, and patted his arm. "It's okay," she told him solemnly. "Everybody makes mistakes. My mom says that all the time." Something in the old man cracked wide open at that, gentle and complete, and he knelt, slowly, joints protesting, until he was eye level with his great-granddaughter for the first time in her life. "Thank you," he said, voice thick. "You are far kinder than I deserve." He reached, hesitant, into his jacket pocket and produced a small carved wooden crane, worn smooth with age. "This was mine, when I was a boy no older than you. My own grandfather made it for me. I have kept it for over 70 years, waiting, I think, for someone worth giving it to. Would you like it?" Zara took it with the immense seriousness 5-year-olds bring to gifts, turning it over carefully in both hands. "I'll keep it forever," she informed him, with the flat, absolute certainty of a child making a promise she fully intends to keep. Watching his grandson Nadia and Zara together in that garden, Kim Dae-sung understood, finally and completely, something it had taken him 81 years and one devastating mistake to learn, that the empire he'd spent decades protecting had never been the thing keeping his family alive. This was the small, ordinary, unguarded moment of a child patting an old man's arm and telling him it was okay to have been wrong. He spent what years he had left exactly as he'd promised, quietly, from a distance, supporting a family he had once nearly destroyed, grateful every single day that they had found their way back to each other despite him, not because of him. He came to birthdays when invited, sent no gifts without asking first whether they were wanted, and learned, slowly, the particular humility of a powerful man allowed back into a family only on the family's own terms. The cafe opened on a clear Saturday in early spring, sunlight doing what 6 months of Seoul rain hadn't, warming the small corner storefront until it glowed gold through the front windows. Nadia had named it simply Diop and Kim, no further explanation offered, though everyone who walked through the door and tasted her thiboudien, alongside Min Jae's grandmother's kimchi jjigae recipe, reworked with a Senegalese spice blend that had taken Nadia 4 months of testing to perfect, understood exactly what the name meant without needing it spelled out. The build-out had taken the better part of a season, Nadia sourcing tile from a supplier in Incheon, who specialized in the particular blue and white patterns her mother had described from Dakar markets. Min Jae learning to hang shelves badly enough that he eventually hired someone properly qualified and settled for painting instead. Zara helping by decorating a corner of the chalkboard menu with a permanent, unerasable drawing of a rabbit wearing a small crown that nobody had the heart to paint over. Mr. Jang, retired from mahjong table gossip at Auntie Sue's table, showed up the week before opening with a housewarming gift of good luck bamboo and stayed to help arrange chairs, because 6 years of Tuesday dinners had made him something like family too. Nadia's closest friend in Seoul, a Nigerian nurse named Adeeze, she'd met in her first lonely year in the city, cried through the entire soft opening dinner and told anyone who'd listened that she'd known, this woman deserved something this good eventually. Min Jae stood behind the counter in an apron that still looked slightly absurd on a man who, less than a year ago, had run one of the country's most feared organizations, not managing anything now, not directing, just there, learning to pull espresso shots under Nadia's patient instruction, and burning his first 3 attempts badly enough that Zara had declared him, with great seriousness, not allowed near the machine anymore. He'd taken to it without complaint. He took to most of ordinary life that way now, a man relearning, day by day, what it meant to build something instead of protect it. His grandfather's fortune, redirected entirely into the legitimate businesses, had funded the cafe's lease without strings attached, exactly as promised. The shipping company had a new board of directors with no ties to the organization's old name, and Minjae, most days, went by nothing more dramatic than the guy who does the coffee wrong, a title Zara had bestowed on him and refused, despite his protests, to retire. On the cafe's back wall, near the small corner table Nadia had set aside specifically for Zara's homework and coloring books, hung a single old photograph in a simple frame. Two young people laughing over burnt coffee. 6 years and a lifetime of grief folded into one faded square of glossy paper. Zara found it one afternoon in early summer, standing on tiptoe on a chair to look at it properly, the way she'd done 100 times before, back when it lived hidden inside a book and she didn't know the man in it at all. "Mom?" She turned, holding something in her other hand, a new photograph, taken just that morning at her school's family day. The three of them squeezed together and laughing at something Zara had said a half-second before the shutter clicked. "Mom, we don't need that old photo anymore." Nadia looked up from the register, and Minjae looked up from the espresso machine, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "Because now," Zara said, holding the new photograph up beside the old one, comparing them with the same grave seriousness she brought to everything. "We're all in the same one." Nadia crossed the cafe and knelt beside her daughter, and Minjae came around the counter and knelt on her other side, and the three of them looked at both photographs together. The one that had once represented 6 years of heartbreak and unanswered questions, and the one that represented everything they'd fought to build in its place. "Can we put the new one up too?" Zara asked. "Right next to it?" "Right next to it," Nadia agreed, voice thick. They pinned it there together, the old photo and the new one, side by side, 6 years of loss and one photograph's worth of found future, hanging on the same wall, not because the old story needed replacing, but because it had finally, after everything, earned its ending. Nadia's mother had come for the opening, the first time she'd left Dakar in a decade, grumbling the entire flight about Korean airline food and grumbling considerably less, 3 days later, about the grandson-in-law she'd spent one very direct phone call interrogating about his intentions before she'd agreed to fly out at all. She'd cried, quietly, in the corner of the cafe on opening day, watching Zara explain the menu to customers with the confident authority of a 5-year-old who considered herself co-owner, and she'd pulled Nadia aside afterward and told her, in Wolof, low enough that no one else could understand, that she was proud, not of the cafe alone, though that too, but of the 6 years of raising a daughter with dignity and no bitterness, of building something worth this much joy out of something that had once broken her so completely. "I wanted you to come home," her mother admitted. "I thought Seoul had taken more from you than it gave back." "It did, for a while," Nadia said. "But I built something here anyway. That's what you taught me how to do." Her mother had looked around the cafe then, at Minjae behind the counter, apron dusted with flour, at Zara's crayon rabbit still unerased in the corner of the chalkboard menu, at the two photographs hanging side by side on the back wall, and said nothing else, because there was, for once, nothing left that needed saying. Outside, Seoul moved on the way cities do, indifferent to the small miracles happening inside corner cafes. But inside Diop and Kim, a man who had once been feared for the harm he could order with 2 raised fingers, now stood with flour on his hands, and his daughter's crayon drawings taped above the register, and a woman who had rebuilt an entire life out of quiet resilience, finally let herself believe that some doors, once closed, could still be opened again, not the same as they were, but stronger for having survived being shut. They could never reclaim the 6 years they'd lost. Nothing, not an apology, not an empire dismantled, not an old man's tears in a garden, could give those years back. But they had, against every reasonable expectation, found their way to the future they were always meant to share. And on the wall of a small cafe that smelled like Thiboudienne and Jjigae in equal measure, 2 photographs hung side by side, proof that the strongest families aren't built by power, or by blood, or even by the truth finally coming to light. They're built by love that refuses, against every odd stacked in front of it, to give up.